Hello, everybody. My name is Petar Jandric, and I'm going to be chairing this session. Welcome to the International Symposium on Democracy, Global Citizenship, and Transformative Education, New Perspectives to Understand, Engage, and Act Together. I would like to thank the organizers for making this happen, and especially in this brilliant free lingual format, which is really very hard to organize, but I think it's so important to get the word out there in as many communities as possible. Excuse me. Today, at today's session, the topic of today's session is critical pedagogy and crisis in the USA. And it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our today's speakers, Antonia Darder and Peter Mclaren. I will start in order of appearance. So Peter is going to be speaking first, so I will first introduce him. Peter Mclaren is Distinguished Professor in Critical Studies, College of Educational Studies, Chapman University, where he is also co-director of the Paulo Freire Democratic Project and International Ambassador for Global Ethics and Social Justice. Peter is also Emeritus Professor of Urban Education, UCLA, and Emeritus Professor of Educational Leadership, Miami University of Ohio. And he is also Honorary Director of the Center for Critical Studies of Education in Northeast Normal University, Changchun, China. Peter is the author and editor of over 45 books and hundreds of scholarly articles and chapters. His writings have been translated into over 20 languages. And besides what is written here on my screen, I just want to say that Peter is really one of the most prominent and probably most important architects and critics and theorists and practitioners of the contemporary critical pedagogy movement. On the other side, we have Antonia Darder, who is a professor of education leadership at Loyola Marymount University. Antonia is internationally recognized Freire scholar. She holds the Levy Presidential Chair of Ethics and Moral Leadership at Loyola Marymount University, LA, and is Professor Emerita of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. For more than 30 years, her practice and scholarship have focused on political questions and ethical concerns linked to racism, class inequalities, language rights, critical pedagogy, Latino education, and social justice. And more recently, her work has sought to articulate a critical theory of leadership for social justice and community engagement, as well as to theorize a pedagogy of beauty in the pursuit of a liberatory practice of education. Antonia's scholarship has been deeply influenced by Paulo Freire, whose ideas on schooling and society profoundly shaped the direction of her early work. I also want to say that Antonia's scholarship has profoundly influenced my work and the whole work of my generation, and it is so great to have you here because of your really important and foundational contributions to critical pedagogy as we know it today. The panel will work in the following way. Peter will speak for about 20 minutes, then Antonia will speak for the next 20 minutes, and after that, we will spend the last 20 minutes in discussion. Peter, the floor is yours. Unmute, yeah.
Thank you so much, Petar, for that introduction. And here it's early in the morning, so I'm going to say good morning, but it may be, late in the evening or late at night for many of you. With memories of the attack on the US Capitol by former President Donald Trump, by his fanatics, planned and coordinated by White House operatives and members of the military and police, whose participants, by the way, were disproportionately military and ex-military. While these memories are still burning their way into our civic brain pans, Americans and their neighbors to the north are reeling from recent polls that show that 1 in 4 Americans and 1 in 5 Canadians believe that democracy is a bad way to run the country and would prefer a strong man, a fascist, to make the decisions without interference of elections. And what is most frightening about this new reality is that almost half of millennials share that view. As Joe Westheimer revealed recently, democracy, it seems, is not self-winding. And according to a Levada Center in Moscow, a recent poll there, 70% of Russians now approve of Stalin and his policies. So we're at this very difficult historical moment. We can talk about that maybe a little bit later during the discussion. So I have some questions to ask about critical pedagogy, given this, context that I've tried to describe briefly. Is critical pedagogy at this present moment but a fleeting residue of its former association with Paulo Freire, whose pathfinding intervention into the dross and drudgery of the banking model of teacher education, right, brought hope and promise to those thirsting for liberation and helped teachers find their backbones in confronting the breathtakingly superficial pageantry of commodity culture and the swindle of neoliberalism that had formed its sacred center in capitalist relations of production. Have critical educators been reduced to circuit preachers, bullwhipped by their congregations who have stubbornly refused any message that stipulates that they sacrifice the comforts of this world? Has the critical educator, personified by Freire, become the impotent interlocutor of times past, who has now gone to seed in distant pastures? Has Freire become the educational talisman for students to cite so that they can earn their credentials as criticalists? Is the potent brew of critical consciousness afforded by a pedagogy of the oppressed now just a cup of thin gruel passed from student to student in what remains of critical pedagogy seminars in this age of fascism? Well, these are far too cynical questions, in my opinion, yet they deserve a response. If Freire's work has been decaffeinated over the years such that it no longer proves a threat to the ruling class any more than the work of Freire's educational precursors, then why, moments before his inauguration in early 2019, did fascist Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro tweet, and I quote, "One of the goals is to get Brazil out of the worst positions in international educational rankings, and it means to combat the Marxist rubbish that is spread in educational institutions." And why on the campaign trail did Bolsonaro say that he wanted to enter the educational ministry with a flamethrower to remove Paulo Freire? Clearly, Freire is a figure whose work needs to be reckoned with. If anything, his work is more relevant today than at any other time in its history. The generative issue driving a curriculum for liberation, for me at least, is understanding the various systems of mediation that have produced us as 21st century compliant and self-censoring human beings who appear defenseless in the face of nationalist calls for military solutions to global problems, of white supremacist chauvinistic attacks on people of color, of narratives championing nationalism, isolationism, and American exceptionalism. Clearly, we need an education that can move socialist struggle from a class in itself to a class for itself. That is, to a class that actively pursues its own interests, following the imperatives of critical dialogical deliberation over what our socialist future should look like. We need a mass movement from below to counter the much more advanced digitalization of today's entire global economy and society, which has utilized for its own ruling class interests the application of fourth industrial revolution technologies led by artificial intelligence and the analysis of big data, i.e. machine learning, automation, robotics, nano and biotechnology, quantum and cloud computing, 3D printing, virtual reality, new forms of energy storage, etc. That will not be an easy task, but it's a necessary one, since we will be continuing our struggle against the formation of a global surveillance state via digital realms, which egregiously tech washes racism in the service of crime prevention and national security. How we appreciate, or rather here we appreciate, how spontaneous self-activity or mass practices such as the recent Black Lives Matter uprising sparked by the murder of George Floyd are also potential expressions of new theoretical developments, as well as new strategies and tactics, so that we can observe how the movement from practice is also a form of theory. And practice is also a form of making history, as history itself is to be understood as in essence an object of human practice. Action takes on a universal significance, going beyond the social world to affect being as such. And that's a quotation from Feinberg. Well, what does it mean to operationalize a pedagogy of liberation? Over the decades, critical pedagogues have rethought the idea of teachers as transformative and public intellectuals, as researchers, as cultural workers. Well, recently, I find the work of Josh Wynn and Mike Neary to have contributed to important projects of converting the university, for instance, from a neoliberal corporation to a worker cooperative with teachers and students as producers, as protagonistic agents, furthering the development of socialism in the commons for the public good. So I wanted to say, just end by describing a little bit about their initiatives. Teachers and students together here become active agents of history. Rather than enabling history to act on them, they act on history in a dialectical dance of revolutionary practice. University campuses can and should, in my view, become places of solidarity with social movements, new and old, as well as labor unions and teachers unions who may be open to socialist alternatives. New initiatives have been advanced for reimagining universities, again, in the model of the worker cooperative, rather than corporation, and along the lines, again, of the students as the producers. The cooperative values that could inform this new design of the university would include, according to Josh Wynn, self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. The principles are voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, educational training and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and a concern for the community. So the platform for building worker cooperatives and for rethinking the very idea of academic labor in the era of cognitive capitalism would, in this model, be the international cooperative movement. As they stand, universities are capitalist employers who reproduce academic labor in the form of student labor. And according to Wynn, knowledge that is produced in this form of organization is powered through value production and exists mainly as a commodity form. But I'm calling here, along with Neary and Wynn and others, for the transformation of the university into a worker-owned and managed cooperative university that would control the means of knowledge production and potentially produce new forms of social knowledge through a common ownership form of property relations that transforms the distinction between public and private in order to create an academic commons designed for the good of the community. And this would involve a new type of student-teacher relationship through forms of solidarity, equity, mutuality in terms of the division of labor. And to conclude here, neoliberal business models based on institutional precedents are replaced by Freirean dialogical models grounded in a historical materialist analysis that stresses the development of critical consciousness and protagonistic agency. The community of scholars comprising the cooperative university would construct the curriculum involving political struggles against the imperatives of capitalist value production. And so in this area, I think there's much work to be done. So in conclusion, finally, critical pedagogy will remain a vital force in shaping the future of our collective commons when teachers assume the role, again, as Henry Giroux has said, of public intellectuals, of social activists, of political protagonists who are able to work with the insight that what happens inside the classrooms or the seminar rooms cannot be disconnected from what is happening in the local community, the school district, and wider precincts of democracy, including state and federal levels of governance, all the way to transnational movements for change. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this great presentation. Antonia?
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thanks, Peter, always a pleasure. I think I was trying to figure out exactly where I would go with things. And then I decided just to really make focus on some comments related to critical pedagogy itself, in the sense that I don't believe, as many people, that somehow critical pedagogy is outdated or somehow, you know, as if it were some kind of a fashion coat that we put on in the late 80s and 90s, and now, you know, we have to move on somewhere else. Instead, I want to just think of some of the issues. So I'm just going to go through this quickly, and then I figure we'll have some time. But since the 1990s, so many educators and researchers and theorists developed works that expanded on the foundational works of critical theorists such as Freire and Giroux and Mclaren and Bell Hooks and Kinchlow, to address more deeply, in a more deep way, specific issues of inequality related to culture and racism, gender, feminism, sexuality, disabilities, and the environment. I mean, folks have been concerned about the ways in which critical pedagogy could inform those discourses. And often, unfortunately, they come to it as, oh, well, critical pedagogy doesn't talk about this or doesn't talk about that. But I don't think that was the job of critical pedagogy. It was always, I believe, to provide these critical principles that loosely could weave different discussions together in ways that included engagement with cultural politics, with economics, with the historicity of knowledge, with dialectics of knowledge, ideology and critique, the notion of hegemony, the importance of resistance and counter-hegemony, praxis, dialogue, conscientization, and the evolution of social consciousness as a collective phenomenon. It is then our continued engagement of these ontological and epistemological principles in the production of knowledge that gives rise to a revolutionary conceptual lens that we call critical pedagogy for making and remaking the world. Similarly, important critiques of critical pedagogy have been generated through efforts to flesh out the manner in which Western influences linked to philosophical principles might unwittingly engender what de Sousa Santos calls an abyssal divide within critical pedagogy, where anything that exists outside its domain is rendered invisible or simply considered irrelevant or non-existent. It's important then to recognize that beyond these philosophical principles of critical pedagogy, key questions of classroom and community, popular education, adult education, and social movement have been essential to this work. The expectations have been that critical educators and researchers practice their labor within the classroom, within communities, and within our own personal lives through enactment of a critical conscious effort to make sense of the world, relating to others, and making decisions about our praxis in very thoughtful and reflective ways. Moreover, they are important to connect both our everyday lives and our labor as teachers and researchers and activists to the larger political project of liberation. And often that element gets lost, and it isn't just a critical pedagogy for critical pedagogy's sake. Critical pedagogy was meant to be part of a larger revolutionary process, a process of remaking, of transforming and reinventing society, as Paulo Freire would say. So this points to a problem then within the context of critical pedagogy, and that this is a praxis that cannot be enacted if an individual does not have a clear political position and commitment to liberation through a lived sense of integrity and coherence in our teaching or scholarly practice, as well as our relationships out in the world. So this is to say that critical pedagogy must be a living pedagogy that extends beyond our labor in schools and communities into the arena of everyday relationships. So in my experience, many people call themselves critical educators or researchers, but few seem able to live consistently a commitment to critical engagement in thought, in ways that are humble, open, and loving. In regards to this, probably Paulo Freire remains a quintessential example of a critical educator who lived his praxis in every sense of that word. So today we live and labor in fundamentally unfree and in a violent world. All we have to do is, look what is happening in Palestine. I mean, a horrendous situation in Palestine. And I wonder, the frustrating thing for me is to know that in many classrooms, this is happening and there's no conversation about it. As such, we are daily then confronted with oppressive forces by ways of exclusionary and repressive ideologies, policies, practices, and relational structures that systematically counter the formation and development of critical or revolutionary educators. This unfortunately then results in major conflicts and contradictions and inconsistencies among individuals who consider themselves committed to social justice within institutions and society. This can result in dehumanizing forms of interactions, such as when Western patriarchal and racializing tendencies surface, which create unnecessary anxiety, struggles, and tensions within our field. With this in mind, then, thinking about the struggles about critical pedagogy requires us to be far more self-reflective and aware of questions related to personal commitment, integrity, and self-vigilance in our enactment of our pedagogy and our politics. This can assist us to acknowledge our frailties and our fragilities in the struggle for our humanity within educational and societal contexts that are driven more often than not by the disgraceful ruthlessness of capitalist greed. And just as revolutionary struggles out in the world do not occur in a vacuum, neither does our formation as critical educators, researchers, or scholars happen in a vacuum. Unfortunately, many of the difficulties that we have seen on the left have also been present within the pedagogical mentoring and scholarly relationship within critical pedagogy. Whether intentional or not, for many, critical pedagogy, it has meant that being critical becomes a sort of method to claim rather than a revolutionary praxis to be lived. In the process, important questions about oppressive forms within and outside the academy are left unexamined. Hence, what we require in these very difficult times more than ever is a willingness to create a truly grounded relationship of solidarity, relationships of comradeship that can support our ongoing critical, political, and pedagogical formation and labor within communities. There is, in fact, no way that we can profess to live and enact a critical pedagogy if we exist and labor alienated from others, and if our boots never touch the ground. Moreover, what should set critical pedagogy apart is the willingness to engage with a wide variety of perspectives and critiques that are generated within and outside the field, which often is not the case. This is to say, we cannot pretend to be liberatory in our praxis and simultaneously silence legitimate perspectives or critiques with which we disagree or cannot relate. Moreover, we must mobilize our democratic capacities to engage with greater openness and curiosity and solidarity the many differences and disagreements that emerge given the multiplicity of perspectives that are out there in the world and that are so much linked to our historical struggles for survival. This is not so that we can somehow arrive to one, claim of absolute truth or an ultimate position, but rather so that we can more forthrightly engage the importance and even democratic necessity of different ways of knowing and being in the world, which result in the diverse positionalities and histories that have shaped and influenced our understanding of education and society. In contrast to conservative notions, and it is not harmful to consider differences in our perspectives, particularly when we take the time to engage carefully the human consequences of our different views and the practices these engender, particularly with respect to the transformation of schools and the world. Therefore, I very much support and appreciate efforts to bring different and contesting views of critical pedagogy into conversation with one another, particularly when these views are expressed with love, respect, faith, and a genuine desire to build solidarity across our differences, so we might struggle against our common enemy. We are not each other's enemy. The enemy is a system of greed and power, an imperialist system that continues to wage war upon the most oppressed. A major criticism of critical pedagogy has often been that it is seen as being somehow too abstract and insufficiently able to engage with questions of praxis on the ground. This is often more related to the fragmented ways in which teacher formation is carried out, where even critical pedagogy becomes simply another method, to be learned. To move from the analytical or conceptual dimension of critical pedagogy, we must then move within the actual arena where a liberatory pedagogy is practiced. For example, if we are preparing critical educators, they must be able to ask difficult questions regarding the context in which they labor. What is the historical realities of those contexts, of those classrooms, of those schools, of those communities? What are the important issues around teacher-student relationships? What are the pedagogical approaches that are best suited for different populations in terms of language, in terms of approach, and the curriculum and the classroom environment itself? The proliferation of the long online distance learning is also an issue that I think certainly raises concerns in this new so-called educational normal, along with the wide marketization of piecemeal curriculum to accommodate disembodied conditions of virtual learning. For critical educators, classroom conditions of democratic education provide opportunities for students to critically grapple together across their differences and similarities in an effort to learn, communicate, and transform inequalities and exclusions within the complexity of their diverse humanity. Vital to such an intellectual formation is the creative tension that's necessary to unfold lively relationships, which are best enacted through their embodied presence within the realities of everyday life. Given the stark separation and virtualized conditions of online learning, students are expected now to function in ways that more often than not disembody their learning. Instead of dynamic classroom dialogue so critical to a question-posing critical pedagogy, students are expected to learn within these lonely online spaces. And I've been really concerned, what is the impact of this pandemic in terms of students, but what will be the impact upon our labor as educators as people move into these virtual spaces and reinforce this learning that's based on this individualized memorization and quantification, instead of students being immersed in an evolving social process of critical engagement, the development of voice and the construction of participatory knowledge. They've been conditioned away from the human contact, social interaction, and the ethics of empathy that is so essential to democratic life. So similarly, then we must be concerned with the manner in which virtual teaching has disfigured the labor of teachers themselves. In the virtual classroom, the difficult labor of teachers has become even more routinized and tediously disembodied than previously, as teachers are expected to function as these technological mediators, dispensers, and agents of a growing virtualized educational culture. I think one of the other things that often concerns me about how the virtual space is being used is how easily it is to surveil that space. And we know that, that in historical instances of fascistic politics in the US or abroad, whether the tracing of suspected, gang youth, and I put that in quotes, in the US, or tracking of dissidents by the Pinochet regime in Chile, it was undertaken through systematic surveillance of youth, utilized as a means to trample dissent. And so I always wonder, what are the ways that all these technologies are going to be deployed and are being deployed to trample dissent? The truth, however, is that the majority of teachers, and this is a piece that always strikes me, is that we talk about critical pedagogy, and those of us who are in the field, but the majority of teachers in the US still do not really understand critical pedagogy. The colonizing phenomenon of teacher education has to be addressed by scholarly stress on greater community participation and the use of popular education methods for initiating new teachers into critical pedagogical praxis. What we need is the development of a revolutionary educational movement that focuses in particular on the need of new teachers. This would serve as an ongoing teaching collectives or community teaching networks that function outside of the purview or control of teacher education programs. Unfortunately, a problem within capitalist society is that people have seldom developed a strong enough sense of participatory movement in terms of political labor or working with others communally as part of their ongoing democratic participation of formation. And this is more true today than it's ever been, interestingly enough. This refers to the collective work needed to be done outside of the traditional institutions that have created or perpetuated many of the problems that we're struggling to transform in education today. So establishing independent popular teacher collectives that focus on supporting new teachers and providing them an ongoing pedagogical space for reflection and dialogue and building community would go a long way to activating critical pedagogical praxis on the ground. Some excellent examples of this work has been done within traditional educational establishments by teacher unions, such as the Chicago Teachers Union and the United Teachers of Los Angeles, who worked with students and parents and businesses and community members beforehand and during strike action that brought about some important changes to the conditions of teachers beyond solely increase in wages. Yet much more work still has to be done by teachers' unions and social movement organizations to address the pedagogical and political needs of teachers who must work within conditions that betray their commitments to a socially just world. Also important is a larger political effort to link the work of education with various community campaigns and national efforts and actions focus on a variety of critical issues outside of education, such as health and housing, immigration, incarceration. All of these issues have to be seen as having some impact on how we think about education. Issues that in a very fundamental way impact the well-being of teachers and students, of parents and community. The current encroachment of neoliberalism into education is not then a new phenomenon, but rather the current phase of this larger capitalist enterprise. As such, neoliberal educational reform must be properly understood as an extension of the greater hegemonic apparatus of the capitalist state. And it very much reflects, the Gramscian notion of hegemony. I mean, it is set up in essence to gain the consent of students, to gain the consent of teachers in ways that often cause them to act against their very own interests. So I would argue that as long as we are embroiled in a ruthless system of capitalist accumulation and a racializing political vision founded on the interests of the ruling class, locally, regionally, and globally, capitalism's authoritarian rule under the guise of neoliberalism, or whatever new term gets employed, will continue to thwart our liberatory educational efforts. This is to say that as long as greed and the barbarity of capitalism persists, the educational system will remain hostile, adverse, and negating of critical pedagogical aims within schools and communities. What we are contending with is a political economy where fierce profit motives undermine the genuine human needs of people. Moreover, what the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted for us clearly is the manner in which the transnational policies and practices of capitalism have raped the planet and resulted in the astounding rate of impoverishment around the world. Lastly, the critical pedagogy community must organize and mobilize worldwide with and in the interests of the most oppressed. However, this requires that we rethink the manner in which we labor, how we define the problems, and the tendency towards fragmented approaches in education, even on the left. For years, I've witnessed an inability of critical education scholars to fully divorce ourselves from the mainstream competitive pursuits of university accolades, of prestige, and resources. Despite all the talk about solidarity and transformation, we have done very little to shift the expectations or practices within our own spheres of influence. There is no question that to do this would be indeed a very difficult task, given the brutal conditions under which we labor within the university. However, there have been important moments where opportunities have arisen to do things differently, and critical scholars have failed to garner the courage and moral commitment to fight together for real change. The consequence is that we remain compromised and unable to extricate ourselves from the whims of university expectations. There is still a wretched tendency to deal with comrades as competitors rather than comrades, who they should be, which has led to many missed opportunities to mobilize in tangible and effective ways. Often we get mired down in identity politics and forget that we are part of a larger struggle against imperialism, for self-determination and for liberation. Yet despite that fact, there is, we know, little prestige, resources, or accolades to be gained from mainstream institutions for our pedagogical work out in communities or within social and labor movement organizations. Yet this is exactly where critical pedagogy as a movement for a humanizing liberatory education must be developed. It has to happen in our work with students, with comrades, and communities. Historic moves that can potentially shift the direction of societies can be achieved through unifying progressive forces for change. We have seen recently this in the work of, I mean, if you look at what's happening in Chile, I mean, incredible. If you look what is happening in terms of the farmers' strike, you know, before the COVID situation just surged completely out of control in India, you see movement in Argentina, in Mexico. And of course, we see what has happened with the Black Lives Matters movement in the ways in which it generated international discussion about anti-Black racism. So to build an effective critical pedagogy movement then would entail that scholars and researchers and teachers bring their political and pedagogical understanding and emancipatory approaches to the work of labor unions, of social movement organizations, and other progressive campaigns where people are committed to fighting for their self-determination, for economic justice, and collective human rights. All this, however, will remain impossible if we fail to come together democratically and in solidarity in order to transform the deep structures of oppression that persist not only in schools and universities, but within the societies in which we struggle daily to live, to labor, to love, and to dream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonia, for this. Actually, I would like to thank both speakers for these amazing and inspiring presentations. And now I would like to invite participants into the discussion. Sure, Paul.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Thanks. Wonderful to see you, Peter, Antonia. Wonderful presentations. Thank you so much. My question is, normative, representative, hegemonic democracy is not responsive to the needs of most people, and it's been boiled down to elections and political processes with political parties that are very alienating. Not only do a lot of people not vote, or if they do vote, it's strategically or not really thinking that this is going to ingratiate them in their material and emotional, cultural needs and lives. My question is, what do you think, what's the bridge or the connector to working people, marginalized peoples around the world that want a more functional, meaningful, participatory, representative democracy, and yet we've got systems in place that seem to continue on that, these governments are elected, and there's a lot of people who feel alienated, and they're doing many excellent things. You've noted some of them around the world, but do you think there's any hope with these normative representative systems that are in place, or how do regular people organize and create solidarity to really create the conditions so that we can start fully addressing, racism, sexism, and the like? Because with the pandemic, it seems that things have gone out of control with military spending and repression and so on. So there it is. Thanks, Peter and Antonia.
Peter, unmute.
Okay. Well, if I could respond, or somebody else would like to respond. You talked about participatory democracy. I mean, we have a representative democracy, largely speaking, at least officially. There's differences between direct democracy, between participatory democracy and representative democracy. These are all connected. I think we have to understand their connection and their embeddedness in capitalist relations of production. There have been experiments, of course, in Brazil and many different countries, and there's been, and these experiments I think are important and should continue. But I think the model of the worker co-op is interesting. It's not just something that could be employed in a university context, but also in contexts, in much wider contexts, in terms of how, we govern ourselves, and we could have consortiums of worker co-ops. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways we could imagine how we could run the country. But I think one of the realizations I think we need to address is how incompatible capitalism and democracy really are. There's a real incompatibility now. I mean, it's especially with the kind of transnational capitalist class that we have now. Capitalism has, moved from global capitalism to transnational capitalism. And we have to understand, I think, how it's become transmogrified in that respect. But right now, I think in the US, there are three big lies that are circulating through the echo chambers of the first lie here in the US is that the 2020 election was stolen, and that Donald Trump is really still the president of the United States. I think it's like 70% or maybe even higher of Republicans believe that Donald Trump is right now, today, is a legitimate president of the United States. But 70% of Republicans still feel that way and believe that way. And this is partly because of the circulation of these big lies. And the way, and I, this is something I think we need to really pursue in critical pedagogy and try to understand this. How, in this post-truth era that we live in now, it's become, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pee Wee Herman, who was a comedian, a US comedian, but he had a famous little segment called "I Know You Are, But What Am I?" And we live in a kind of, I know you are, but what am I politics? So that if, in fact, you try to make an argument that there's systemic racism in the United States, the response from a Republican opponent would be, oh, well, you're racist in pointing that out. If you point out that, there's growing white supremacy and growing number of armed militant groups in the United States, or, you know, and that they're white supremacists, and say, well, you're a white supremacist by saying that. I mean, again, it's like, I know you are, but what am I? If you point something out, then you're the problem for pointing it out. And then the conversation ends there. There's no real dialogue. There's no real, you know, there's no real principles of adjudicating the difference between an opinion and an argument. So I think all of these kinds of issues need to be explored. I'll stop there.
Paul, I think, you know, I mean, the question you're asking is a central question that probably reverberates across this entire conference, because the question of democracy, you know, often has been bastardized in all sorts of ways, and that's what we see that has happened. I mean, if you look at what democracy initially, it was supposed to be a force to bring voice to the oppressed, to those who had no power, who had no land, who had no money. And now, you know, democracy, you know, for some people means, you know, your ability to shop, you know, wherever you want, you know, to buy whatever your little heart's content. So I think that one of the pieces around this is our capacity to re-inspire the meaning of democracy, bring it back to its true meaning and its true political purpose in society, which means then we have to cultivate a revolutionary imagination about what it means to be a democratic society, a democratic world, what it means to be, you know, historical subjects who can participate in democracy. I mean, in so many ways for Paulo, you know, that was the purpose of education. It was to create the conditions where students would come to voice, where they through, not that they were not given voice by a teacher. The teacher doesn't give the student voice. We create the conditions where students themselves, through their engagement, their communal engagement, their collective engagement, begin to find voice, begin to find a comradely sense of solidarity, of participation, and of making decisions and coming back to those decisions and thinking about them. All of those elements are so key to any kind of democratic life. And in so many ways, what we see is that that's what has been truncated. And so much of our work, I believe our political work as educators, as cultural workers, is to re-inspire those conversations that are not happening. I mean, that's why, you know, to me, these large movements, you know, people say, oh, well, they're just movement. No, what is happening in Chile is huge. What is happening, you know, in India is huge. What's happened with Black Lives Matter is huge. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just a spontaneous thing. I mean, there were years and years of work. And that's the kind of attitude that we have to have. We are in a class struggle. We are in a political struggle. It means we've got to be willing to, you know, roll our sleeves up, to not give a fuck, excuse me, my language, not to give a damn about whether we're given this award or that award, or where we're promoted here, that we should be caring about the kinds of relationships that we create on the street, that we create with organizations, you know, and think of the ways in which we can support others. So the sense of supporting others, not so that they, you know, not to support their career. I mean, I'm not interested in working with students who are concerned about their careers. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't give a damn about that. I want to work with students who see that they want to try to use their scholarship politically to intervene in ways that ask new questions and that push. I mean, and that I believe is part of what we have to do. We have to continue to push. Is it easy? Hell no. Are the conditions difficult? Absolutely. I mean, that's, you know, to tell people that the conditions are difficult, to me is, you know, this is a no-brainer. This is what we've been dealing with. But I've been dealing with this. I've been in this for 50 years. You know, Peter's been in, well, probably a little bit longer than me. You know, I'm going to be 70, you know, and I'm still doing this. So, you know, if you've been doing this for 10 years and you're tired, you know, then you don't have the right attitude around this political struggle and around this work. It is work that we have to commit to as a part of our vocation, our life vocation. And we've got to be willing to create the kind of relationships with others that sustain us and that help us to mobilize a different definition of what it means, what democratic life looks like and what it means, so that we can continue in whatever ways we can within the influences that we have to counter oppressive conditions, inequalities, racism, sexism, all of the forms of inequalities that we find, all the dehumanizing forms of inequality, and use our lives, our understanding of the world, our ability to enter into dialogue, our capacity and willingness to continue growing in consciousness with others as a means for us to think through together what democracy means within our particular context.
Thank you very much. We have 3 questions in the chat and 9 minutes altogether. So I'm going to read the questions one by one, but guys, please try to be short, otherwise we're not going to get to answer all of them. So the first comment or question was by Michael, and he says, the very first comment by Peter about the rise in popularity of authoritarian policies in the US and Canada, especially among young people, are there also spaces for hope?
Yes, there are spaces for hope. I am hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. And I think there's a difference between optimism and hope. Hope needs to be conjugated with struggle, right? If that's what we mean by hope. We just can't be hopeful like, gee, I wish things would be different, and sit on the sidelines and just think, wow, I wish, I was born into a different world. But hope needs to be, and I think it was Cornel West that mentioned this, that hope needs to be conjugated with struggle, a kind of revolutionary struggle that Antonia was referring to in her talk. How many of us are willing to do that? Sometimes we need to get our backs completely pushed against the wall in order to do that. Look what's happening right now in Colombia. It's unbelievable. And, I've been following and in contact with some of the protesters there. And the sentiment is, we have nothing to lose. As the government, the paramilitary, the Patracos, are assassinating the protesters, gunning them down, shooting them, killing them. It's that feeling, I think, that there's nothing to lose. We've been struggling for so long and we're so desperate that we feel we have got nothing to lose. And then, of course, the military comes in and you suffer the consequences. So this gets us into all kinds of discussions about what are the strategies and what are the tactics that we need to, and if we're looking at an alternative, and I think the hope really for me is, the hope is in a socialist alternative to value production. Value production, I'm referring to as monetized wealth. Looking to create a social universe outside of commodity production, outside of profit making. That's what I mean by value production. And looking at how we can achieve that. We don't have a blueprint for it, but we need to come up with something that captures, the imagination and the commitment of masses of people. Because the idea of we need a socialist alternative has to achieve hegemonic ascendancy. It has, people need to believe in that. Yes, that's the way to go. Not just, well, we've got no other choice, our backs are up against the wall. So yes, I think there's a lot of room for hope.
Peter, I absolutely agree with you. However, I think that one of the pieces that we sometimes forget is there's this sense of what meaningful participation means for people. And often I have been in situations where, I don't have any problems getting a very diverse group of students. I mean, I've always graduated 6 to 8 students, doctoral students a year for 20 something years, almost 30 years. And people would say, well, how do you, and I said, people come where there's something meaningful to them. people participate when there is something to participate in that is relevant in relationship to their lives, that echoes in one way or another, resonates with the reality of their lives. So I feel that this question of hope has to be a hope that is constructed collectively, that is part of a communal process where people labor together. And it is in that embodied labor together that we create hope, and we also create the possibilities for a new world. I think essential to this is also the fact of, how do we abandon, bourgeois tendencies that have been so damn embedded in so-called first world societies that we're not even aware of how sometimes we fall, we become entrapped by those, and they weaken our capacity to be coherent in relationship to our political work. The question of economic democracy has to be central. So when we think of democracy, it isn't only in relationship, to social participation. I'm talking about also economic participation. And the only ways that can happen is as people struggle together. There are communities, there are smaller communities, in El Salvador and in other areas. Nueva Esperanza is a wonderful example where there is a collective communal economics of a community of 500. But the question is, how does that happen, in larger ways? But the issue of hope, to me, because I grew up so poor. I mean, there's no reason I should even be talking to you, that I should even be part of this kind of a panel, given the structural realities in which I was born and the kind of conditions I was born into. But in some ways, it is also what always keeps me hopeful. I know that we can change together the conditions in the world at my very core. It's not an abstraction. To me, at the very core, I know that collective struggle, the people in Chile know that collective struggle is what is going to change that society. People in India know that. The Palestinians are struggling. They're dying for their struggle. But people know that the only way that we can change is in this very embodied struggle, and it can only happen on the ground.
Thank you very much. This is really brilliant, as Michael said. We have 2 more minutes, literally, and we have far too many questions. I'm not really sure where to start. Maybe just to leave the questions for later and ask each of you to give a 1-minute conclusion or 1-minute last thoughts. Unmute us.
Okay. I can give just a very short statement. I really love what Antonia was saying. I would put it this way, that the United States champions itself as the defender of civil rights, but time and time again, year after year, it refuses to include economic rights in its understanding of civil rights. Everywhere else, when you talk about civil rights, it's assumed that that includes economic rights. But in the United States, it has always avoided bringing economic rights into the discussion of civil rights. So I really appreciate that. Black Lives Matter, Antifa now have been designated, or at least they were designated by the Trump administration as a terrorist organization. Right now, there's attacks on Marxists in the United States, and anyone that employs critical race theory in their work. The term is critical race theory, but that would include obviously critical theory. It would also include critical pedagogy. So there's a concerted battle now to attack critical educators in the United States. The struggle is ongoing, and I appreciate everyone who's listening to our discussion, and we hope to, bridge some of the geographical boundaries, and I look forward to communicating with some of you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Peter.
Peter. Antonia. Yeah.
All right. I think I mean, for me, I always come back to this thing that democracy isn't guaranteed. There's nothing that, as long as human beings are alive, they will continue to struggle. Issues of power will always be on the table. The question is, are there ways for us to engage with these questions of power and control and self-determination in ways that bring about just societies? You know, are there ways for us to understand that the fact that democracy is not guaranteed means that democracy isn't somewhere we're going to get to. It isn't, you know, an objective, you know, that we have. It is a political process in which we have to participate, and we have to participate consistently. And part of what schools are supposed to be about is a humanizing democracy, a humanizing possibility of being able to participate for democratic ideals. And again, you know, to my core, I believe that we have the capacity to change the world. I would not have stayed in this as long as I have. I don't know, you know, I see bits here and there, and we, you know, but what I always see is that we can never be complacent. We can never think, oh, you know, we've gotten there. You know, at one time we had, you know, we've had to struggle around bilingual education, for example, in the United States. And, you know, we thought we had it, and then we didn't. And then we have to fight again for it. I think that that's just part and parcel of democratic life, is that we have to be willing to stay engaged. And so the question is, how do we make it compelling for human beings to be engaged with one another and within the world in which we live?
Antonia, Peter, thank you so much for your beautiful presentations, for this wonderful discussion. I need to apologize to some of the participants. There are probably 7 or 8 questions that we haven't even managed to read, not to answer. But the organizers have organized a happy hour every day between 3:30 and 4:30, where the floor will be open for open dialogue and for open discussion. And everybody is warmly invited to these happy hours. I think I will be moderating some of them. I need to check my calendar. But anyway, thank you very much, and see you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Peter, maybe just before we close out, if I can also thank Antonia and Peter for your wonderful contribution. Engaging and insightful, but it's wonderful. And then there's a lot of love in what you're saying. And I think that the message resonates. We'll put the video up on YouTube so we can share it with other people who aren't there. It's only an hour, but there's so much there. But also on the Facebook page of the symposium, if people want to continue discussion, and maybe if Antonia and Peter are able to check in. But once again, thank you so much. And I hope we'll be able to get together maybe in 2022.
Yeah, that would be wonderful, in the flesh.
Thank you as well, to everyone.
All right, thank you.
Best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.